A lot of us brought up in churches and religious organizations, and we're always kind of taught, no, it's a good, safe place. It's a nice place. And for many of us, it was. For many others, though, it is not, and a place that some look back on with a lot of sadness and a lot of trauma. As an adult, you can look at some of these places, and we're also told we respect it. It's a religious organization. That's their beliefs. Just leave them alone. What I find scary about that is the fact that we have free thinking, we have free will. And when we see things going on that look to be questionable or possibly traumatic to people, the only thing that's stopping anyone looking into some of those cases more is the word religion and a group that this is how they do things and we all should back off. But that doesn't necessarily seem to be the best idea when people are suffering and it's right in front of us. And the only thing that's stopping it is religion. Dr. Laura Anderson is joining us to discuss just that, a licensed psychotherapist, trauma resolution coach, and religious trauma consultant. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation because it's something that I have been noticing so much in so many of the cases that we follow. A lot of these things stem back to some sort of extreme religious belief, and that is used as justification for whatever sort of ill behavior one may be playing out. Sometimes they're aware. Sometimes I think it's the indoctrination that people don't even realize how dark things can get. And there's so much to talk about here, Laura. So I want to start by getting your story. How did you go into this area? Why did you feel passionate about this to try and help people who are suffering from religious trauma?
Yeah, well, a little bit of it is kind of what you were saying there. Religion has colloquially and culturally been looked at as a very pro-social factor. I came from a high control religion. My dad was a director at a fundamentalist church camp where I lived year round. I experienced a lot of different things as an adult. I live in the Bible Belt in the South, right in the buckle of the Bible Belt, and where religion is just a part of everyday life. They ask you, "What's your name and what church do you go to?"
Hmm.
That's how people introduce themselves. And as somebody who had experienced a lot of abuse and adverse religious experiences myself, and had done a lot of trauma healing work around that, I started to notice it just in my clients in their everyday interactions, where they would say, "This thing happened to me. It wasn't necessarily like clergy sexual abuse, which is what we
Hmm.
traditionally think of when we think of
Yeah.
religious trauma, but their bodies physiologically, they're presenting very similarly to other victims of trauma. And so I started putting some of these pieces together and starting to recognize that these institutions that have traditionally been considered safe and supportive and the place you go to for identity and kind of a higher purpose other than yourself were actually the places where so much harm was actually happening. And so that was what really inspired my own work, to begin to branch out with clients and kind of be known as somebody who works with this population.
Sure. I mean, and you're exactly right. Those places to many were safe, and to many they still are. I want to
Yes.
be careful to
Yes.
say that on this is not a let's bash religion episode. This is more so let's be more aware of what we are accepting and saying as safe and okay before we just say it's safe and okay because someone's holding a cross. That
Mm.
doesn't always necessarily mean the best of intentions. There, it can also be a way that people use to manipulate and to get to people or to groom them. And you're right. You're exactly right in that earlier point that it's not always some sort of sexual deviancy that's going on. Obviously, there's far too much of that, and we see that in so many cases. But sometimes it goes beyond that. In many cases, I think it goes beyond that, where it's a grooming type of behavior to get people to act in a certain way for a certain purpose. And it's easy to say, well, it's what God wants you to do. It's also easy to influence young people or children or people who maybe don't know a whole lot about God or religion, who are new to it and they're finding it to be a safe place to say, well, this is what this is. But in reality, some of those directives, some of that grooming behavior is the furthest thing from biblical teaching.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think anytime we put God as kind of like an umbrella
Mhm.
over this is why you must do X, Y, and Z, or this is why you must believe this thing, we are invoking another dynamic of power and control where we've got certain people or a person at the top saying, here's how you must live. And oh, by the way, this is the right, godly, biblical way according to the holy text,
Mhm.
and that puts eternal consequence on it. It puts additional consequence. If I don't follow this, perhaps I'll be disconnected from the community. My ability to access family and friends, or maybe make a living for those people who are full time, like being paid by churches. There's a lot of, in these communities of high control religion, there's a lot of different, like, identity factors that are
Mhm.
all wrapped up in that particular faith or that particular religion, or belief system. And so to simply get out of it or to stop believing it is fairly impossible, because you don't know who you are outside of that. And we see that all the time. I know some of the cases that you talk about, like there's those religious components, and some of the reasons that they do the things that they do is because that's what God said, or because it's a part of a belief system that they uphold, or they believe that they are doing the right thing according to their religion. And so anytime that we put God in the mix of this is why we do what we do, it adds a lot of justification for really dangerous behaviors and systems of belief and thinking and values that aren't you can't just turn it off. You can't just say no thank you. You have to believe it.
And there are so many paths we could go down here and talk about far longer than we have. Maybe we'll do another one of these down the road. But just tell me from your experience, what are some of the main things that you see when people come to you who have a religious trauma that they are working through? Maybe they're not even aware that they have it. What are some of the most common that you deal with in your practice that, maybe these are things people didn't talk about 20, 30
Yeah.
years ago?
Yeah. So, one of the statements that I make a lot on social media, in my book, in other podcasts, is that religious trauma is trauma. And the reason I say that is because I view the word religious in religious trauma as a bit of an adjective that helps us understand the context under which maybe the abuse or trauma resulted from. And so that's important because when we're looking for signs, okay, is this religious trauma? Was I traumatized by this group or this system or this person? We actually have a great deal of research available to us that shows here's kind of how traumatized individuals might present. And so I really view religious trauma under the umbrella of complex trauma. We have PTSD, which is kind of our single incident traumas. It's our car accidents, it's the experiences in war, kind of some of the things that we traditionally consider trauma.
Mhm.
And then we have what we consider complex trauma. And these are going to be maybe not overt, like single incidences, but it's going to be kind of this persistent, consistent threats of overwhelm that is inescapable, that happens over a long period of time. So when you think about being in a high control religion, we're talking about people that maybe don't have the ability to escape. You think about a child who is born into this. They don't get to fight back. They don't get to run away. They have nowhere to go. And so they're kind of in this space of constant activation, where they are feeling endangered a lot of the time. So when we're coming out of that, when the clients are landing in my office or the offices of my colleagues, we're seeing a lot of things like hypervigilance, social phobias, autoimmune disorders, gastrointestinal disorders, relational difficulties, um, behavioral issue or behavioral health issues, mental health issues such as OCD, anxiety, depression, all sorts of different symptoms that are resulting from these systems. Sometimes it's the way they coped with a high control system, and other times, in a lot of cases, the way that trauma works is that our body kind of is in survival mode. And when we finally are able to get out of survival mode, we start to see various symptoms arise. after the fact, after our
Mhm.
body knows, okay, we're safe. And so that can then also look like feeling very hyper vigilant, very triggered. Perhaps I live in the South where they play, religious music in every store. And so you're walking down the aisle of Target and all of a sudden you hear a religious song and it's like, I've got to get out of here.
Mhm.
Or I start sweating, my heart starts beating faster. I feel like, I want to crawl out of my skin. Those are what we would call trauma responses,
Mhm.
where our body is feeling like we are back in this dangerous spot. So we also look for some of those, what we might consider overinflated responses to maybe some normal kind of everyday things that happen. But if people are going, hey, do I have this? Is this something that might resonate with what my experience has been? I always encourage people. I don't love Google, but it works for this, to Google complex PTSD or complex trauma and look at some of the symptoms and see how does my kind of present day experience fit into those symptoms? Would that be, something that I identify with? And that can oftentimes be a really good starting place to say, maybe the things that I experienced resulted in trauma and didn't go away simply because I stopped believing
Mhm.
X, Y, or Z, or because I left this building and decided to not go back.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, those are a lot of the effects of the trauma that happen throughout life. What would you say are some of the things that define the trauma itself when you're looking at an organization or a group of people? The starting point, essentially. What are the behaviors, the red flags that you see in those sort of groups? That at the end of the day, once this recipe has been made and the effects have gone on to the people, you're going to see these sort of effects. What are those actions? What are the big things that maybe people didn't even realize that it's going down a dark road? Because a lot of times it can be very insidious when we're talking
Yeah.
about something like religion.
Yeah. So, one of the clarifications I want to make really quickly is that oftentimes when somebody says, like, what is trauma?
Hmm.
I'll say trauma is not the thing that happens to us, but it's the way that our body responds or our nervous system responds to the thing that happens to us. So, that would mean like abuse and trauma are not the same thing. It
Hmm.
would mean that abuse potentially could result in trauma.
Sure.
So, when we talk about what kind of leads to this trauma, we are talking probably more about abuse
Hmm.
and high control behaviors and thought patterns and ways of having control over people. So we're going to be looking at things such as like isolation. It could mean that we require you to only be friends or in relationship with people who we deem to be okay and safe. It could be information control, where we get to dictate what you can read, what you can listen to, what you can watch, because we want to make sure it's on the approved list. You have to account for where you have been and how you've spent your time and who you're in contact with. It could be things like very rigid definitions of gender and sexuality and putting a hierarchy within that as well. A lot of times in high control religions, we see a lot of patriarchal values where men in particular have more power than women. And because of that disparity, there's a lot of behaviors that can happen that are abusive in nature. We look at things like emotional abuse. We look at things like spiritual abuse. That would be something like, I'm doing this, because God said, or in the name of God. And that could even be very harmful behaviors. But we, again, have God as our umbrella. And so that makes it okay. Um, it could be threats, accusations. If you were to I know I've heard it said to me, I've heard it said to other people, if you do X, Y, and Z, we're going to come after you. We're going to, or we're going to let you loose. We're not going to be protective of you anymore. The devil is out to get you. A prime example of this would be in Scientology. They have a concept called fair gaming,
Hmm.
which is this idea that if you leave the Church of Scientology, you are now fair game for whatever behaviors would naturally or unnaturally occur. And so oftentimes that means they are harassing you, they're stalking you, they're going to your employers, friends, family, bad mouthing you, making up rumors because you are now fair game. You're not a part of their fold. And so we look at these behaviors that sometimes seem really meaning like not having a lot of meaning behind them. Oh, it's just this tiny thing. It's just this little thing. My church requires that I give 10% of my income, or requires that I wear this or I don't wear this, or I do these practices or I give this amount of time. And that's just it. But over time we see that when these tiny things are stacked on top of each other, is requiring more and more of our time, energy, efforts, resources. It's taking away our own autonomy and identity. And oftentimes there's consequences for saying no to those things. And so we look at that and we go, that's where the trauma may really result from, is that we're constantly in these hypervigilant modes that if we do not abide by these types of behaviors, we could be disconnected, we could be sent to hell. There's a whole variety of
Mhm.
things that might be befall us because of not
Yeah.
abiding by those things.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, you think back to, I mean, I think back to my childhood. I was brought up in a Lutheran religion, and really, for the most part, I don't have many complaints. They had good food in the basement, and it was fairly boring, to be
Yeah.
completely honest. But when we look at some of religions that do go down some very weird paths. One that comes to mind that I've been fascinated with because the family is actually here in the backyard of. I'm in Northwest Arkansas. You probably already know who I'm talking about, the Duggars,
Yes, we
the
sure do. Yeah.
independent fundamentalist Baptists. That is the group that they are a
Yeah.
part of. I want to try and ask you to get into the mind of someone like a Jim Bob or Michelle, the parents. As hard as that may be, please don't start trying to talk like Michelle or anything. That would be awkward.
Oh God.
But
No, 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 no. Yeah.
but but what always has struck me is so bizarre, and this is just one example of when you're wrapped up in this religion, and you could insert other religions here too, but there's uh, specifically when it was about the sexual abuse from Josh to the girls. They
Mhm.
were well aware. It
Mhm.
had been admitted, it had been talked about. This was not like, oh my gosh, you're catching me off guard. But as parents, the
Mhm.
behavior was so insane of let's keep him around. Let's the daughters, I mean, it felt almost dismissed. And obviously, we've heard their side of the stories now that all these years have passed and they're not under the control of what the family wanted to be out there of this perfect image. But why? Why, as parental figures, as parents that otherwise seem to come across as very loving, caring, strict in their own ways, but also having a moral compass, one would think, to suddenly have that compass go haywire and be able to still justify their own behavior, their own cover up, their own lack seeming of care that there's an abuser in their own home,
Mhm.
and just kind of poo poo that away.
Mhm.
How does one do that and still and use religion to justify that? Because that seems to be a lot of what they did in that sort of case, and it's a pattern. Other people do the exact same sort of thing.
Mhm. Yeah, so I can't speak for all doctrines, all
Hmm.
theological viewpoints, but I do know that in a lot of high control religions, one of kind of their foundational beliefs is this idea that you are born a sinful or evil person. So from the moment you are born, the first breath you take, you are a sinner. And with that, there is no good in you. There is no way that of your own volition, you could choose what is good or right or pure or true. Um, and so when we have that as our foundation, then there is this expectation that we would do really awful, horrible, cruel things, even to other people. Um, but that's not necessarily considered illegal behavior, or at least it's not first considered illegal behavior. It's first considered a sin and evidence of why you need a savior. Why, it kind of proves its own point. Oh, you did these things. That affirms our point that, you really are an evil person. You really were born evil, and therefore you need a savior. And so they're kind of it's this baseline of like, this is, yeah, it's illegal behavior according to the law, but I serve a god that's above the law. And so I first, have to call it what it is, and that's a sin. Well, then in those environments, there's a process of how to deal with sin, and it's in-house. and it's through their own processes of repentance and getting right with God and examining what led you to that behavior, which in Josh Duggar's case or anywhere that there's clergy sexual abuse, it's almost always at least partially the responsibility of the victim. They made you do it. You were giving in to your sinful sexual urges because you're a sexual being, and she wore shorts that were too short, and so therefore,
Hmm.
they must take responsibility as well. But when we start off that you are evil and a sinner, when you sin, then it's a God problem. It's not a legal problem. And so I think Jim Bob and Michelle in this case were smart enough to know, like, if this gets out, this could be really bad for us. So we do have to do something. Um, but we don't have to go so far as like saying he's a sexual offender and he should not be in the home or for sure left unsupervised with small children.
Hmm.
They couldn't go that way because they believed that if Josh could just get right with God, then this wouldn't happen again.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, we see that happening over and over and over. We see that, just recently, the Southern Baptist Church came out with all of these clergy sexual abuse scandals. We see that in the Catholic Church. We see it in a lot of non-denominational and evangelical churches. And we see it all over the place. And time again, they say this is something we deal with in-house. This is something that like if they're a member of ours, we use church discipline. We don't necessarily have to bring that person, before the law, because ultimately God is above the law. It's it's convenient. We'll just say that. It's
Hmm.
convenient that that they are able to tell themselves they don't have to deal with it
Yeah.
how the rest of society
It
does.
seems like a lot of compartmentalizing that goes on there where they're able to act in very strange ways, which I want to talk about in a moment. But I mean, another part of that whole story and situation that, I mean, it's easy on the outside looking in, without a doubt, for anybody to play armchair quarterback and say, why wouldn't you do things this way? And one of those things that I think a lot of people look at is Josh's wife, Anna Duggar, who's still there. They got the kids. I understand, that aspect of it, being a parent to a certain extent, but not this at all. To me, the best thing I think that could happen for those children is that they never see their father again for the rest of their life, and just live a life that is not going to be filled with that sort of chaos. What
Mhm.
I mean, I would imagine in your practice, you've had people come in maybe not exactly the same sort of circumstance, but coming out of something, and maybe they know something's a little bit off, or they really know something's off. But what would you say to someone like Anna who's in that sort of a situation? I mean, it totally looks like she's still wrapped up in a cycle of abuse and not seeing any way out. How does someone who is in that sort of situation, move to a place of, I guess, enlightenment, if you will, and the ability to see what they've been going through is not right for them or their family.
Yeah. So a little backtrack, but it applies to this. Before I started working with religious trauma and spiritual abuse, I worked almost exclusively with victims of domestic violence. So mostly women who were in or trying to get in or had just gotten out of domestically violent relationships. And one of the first things that we started to do was, one of the first kind of steps, even in getting them out, was helping them reconnect to their own voice. Meaning, what do I think? What is right for me? What matters? What is my value? What do I want? Because so many times in a high control relationship or a high control religion, which are basically the same dynamics, what the perpetrator or abuser or the person in charge does is they seek to take away your independence, your autonomy, your sense of self identity, and they replace it with theirs. And so, if we can start to tap back into who am I? What do I really think? What do I really want? And get them being a little bit curious about what's going on, that's usually a really good space to start, because then they're able to go like, "Oh yeah, that's not right. Why is it okay for this person to do this but not me?
Mhm.
Why would this person get punished on the outside world for this but not here, and instead the victim's blamed?" And so I think that ability to be curious is a really good place to start because it's not just, leaving the relationship. We've seen enough reports on the news of victims of domestic violence who try to get away. And in that getting away, that's when they are severely harmed or killed, right? And so we know that that's the most dangerous time. And so we don't ever want to just say, hey, just go ahead and leave, whether it's leaving the church, leaving a person. I think about Anna Duggar in particular. She has a whole, a whole group of kids that she's got to take care of. She doesn't have any real way of earning income. She doesn't have skills. She didn't go to school to learn things that would give her the ability to provide for her children. On top of that, she's got her parents and in-laws that are deeply entrenched and invested in keeping her under their control.
Mhm.
I most people don't know that Anna came from a very, very fundamentalist family as well,
Yeah.
the Waller family. And so she doesn't have any support outside of that.
Mhm.
And so to say, Anna, you just need to get up and leave, where is she gonna go?
Oh,
What is she gonna
exactly.
do? Now,
Yeah.
her in particular, she might, because of her notoriety just as a Duggar, she may have some access to resources, but most people don't. And so when we're looking to like, how do we get out? We have to start slowly. The way that I work with clients who are getting out of high control religions, whether that's a cult or a very high control religion, is the same way I advise with a domestically violent relationship. We make a plan, we take our time, we, look for supports, whether that is financial support, housing support, job support, emotional support, relational support, and we do it slowly so that when the moment comes where you go, okay, it's time,
Mhm.
we actually have something to fall back on.
That makes a lot of sense, and if she never had been given the tools, in childhood to do that,
Yeah.
I mean, it is, you look at, and like I said, so easy on the outside to look in and say, "Why not?" Well,
Mm.
she has no idea, if she was never
Yeah.
trained, she was never raised to see that, and she's in a very insulated environment where they don't learn that. They make a point to not teach you that, to very
Mhm.
much keep you under their control. Why? What is that though? Why the desire for such control in some of these communities? I mean, it just seems that seems very much of this earth. That seems very much a human
Mhm.
idea, not so much a Jesus or God or this or that. That seems very much a very male type. I need to keep things under wrap
Yeah.
type attitude. How is that justified in groups like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that religion and many other groups outside of religion. So this is not religion doesn't have the corner market on this, but
Yeah.
religion understands that as humans, we really thrive on things like certainty and stability and safety. And so when you put parameters, rules, what's good, what's bad, that speaks to a human's nervous system and says, okay, well, if I just do everything on the good list, then I'm going to be safe and stable and connected. And in some cases, I have a great eternal destiny waiting for me.
Mhm.
And that feels very appealing. And if I do the bad things, then we have the opposite. But what happens then is there's people, and I believe this comes from fear and just kind of this feeling of constant overwhelm of going like, okay, but well, we need a little bit more this and a little bit more that and oh this interpretation here and so all of a sudden we are creating these rules that are putting people into tinier and tinier boxes, but to be inside that box then means you're safe. And I think that can be extreme, like it's playing on the human desire to be safe, truly. And so they go, okay, well we can be safe. And then there's also human desire to be powerful,
Mhm.
to, to be able to exert yourself. And I think in patriarchal systems, it can be really nice to be in a powerful position and to create a lot of rules with some really devastating consequences if you don't play by that. It gives them that sense of, human certainty and safety as well.
Yeah.
I don't agree with it, but we see it all the time. I remember years ago I was reading a book by Eckhart Tolle and he was talking about the origins of different kind of world religions because he says, like if you look back, all of the major religions kind of have the same plot lines. There's, there's always the same points. And he said, but what happened then is in this need for certainty to understand what is life, what happens after death, things like that, people start creating rules. And then they want to be right about those rules. So they create more rules. And it's an attempt to be good and worthy and saved, but it's at the expense of human autonomy and self-identity and uniqueness and all the things that make humans beautiful. We just try to shave it down and make it very knowable,
Yeah.
and it ends up taking away people's autonomy.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much a trade-off, it seems, and it's
Yeah.
obviously fairly important to to indoctrinate young people
Yes.
into this while they're more moldable because it doesn't always work so great. The more one lives
Yes.
life,
Mm.
but yeah, it's a trade-off very much of hey, you are going to have safety, you're going to have this family, you're going to have this and that, and look at all these great things that you're going to have in your
Mm.
life. But you go outside our bounds, you're going to rot in hell. And I mean, it's like
All
what
that's
what
gone.
what
Yeah.
worse thing could you say to someone to scare them of like, I'm going to literally burn? So yeah, I mean, I can understand how that can make an impact on a child. I mean, I remember
Yeah.
coloring in Sunday school and like, what are we drawing today? And it's flames, and it's a woman that turned into a statue of salt as she ran away from the city. Like, I would love to get my hands on these coloring books again that we had back then because they're insane. But we were just like, this is great back in those days. I want to ask you about this, and I do harp on this group probably more than others, and I don't have anything against their group per se, but I do notice a trend, and I've noticed it over the last year. It's very out of sync with other groups. If you were to say of all these crime cases that we follow, what, if any, religion are the perpetrators? And if you just look statistically at the amount of people who are members of the LDS Church versus the amount of major crimes and horrible things that we're hearing, it's very much out of whack proportionally as to how many seem to have roots somewhere within the LDS Church. I can name so many cases this year where it was an LDS type family and then mom poisons dad, dad poisons mom. Somebody takes out the whole family, or it goes into, some weird spin off of it, like Chad and Lori Daybell, for example. And I,
Mm.
I know they were not technically members of LDS at the time of their crimes, but it did start there. That's where that did they began. And I
Mhm.
know actively there's LDS Church is not out there trying to necessarily kill people or create psychopaths, but
Mhm.
does that environment, and in that one specifically, does it create an atmosphere where people are more likely to go off their own way and have some sort of justification for
Mhm.
very, very bad behavior? Because like I said, there just seems to be a lot of it that comes out of that group. I know many who are that are lovely human beings. It's a big part of their life. I have no problem with that. But it just numbers wise, there's a spike there. And why, I guess, would it be with a group like that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that these are natural environments for sociopathic and psychopathic behaviors. Of course, I can't diagnose these people because
Sure.
they're not my clients. I don't know them. But just looking at the sheer behaviors of people, whether that's within the LDS church or not,
Mhm.
I do think that these are environments that are prime for crimes, for narcissism, or at least narcissistic behavior.
Mhm.
We hear about some of the extreme stuff. We hear about Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow, and we're like, oh my God. And yet, like, it is extreme. And I don't want to take away from that.
Mhm.
And yet, there's so many other churches that have just not quite as extreme practices that are every day, whether that's LDS, whether that is independent fundamentalist Baptists, like the Duggars, Oh gosh, what's the group up by Boise, Idaho? Doug Wilson's group. I can't remember what their name.
Yeah.
I mean, their practices are wild. Also, we hear stories of rampant sexual abuse
Yeah.
coming out of there. We hear a lot of stories of people that treat their children and women like animals
Yeah.
because they believe that's what the Bible says.
Yeah. A
And
lot
so I think,
horror stories coming out of Jehovah's Witness too. There's
yes,
so much.
yes. Absolutely. And so I think that, again, we're creating this box that's smaller and smaller. And we have to remember that there's someone or some bodies that are defining what should be in that box, right? And depending on who they are and their own mental space or how, egotistical or maniacal they are, we can create a lot of different kind of behaviors that the outside would go, Wait, what?"
Mhm.
Like that's not ethical, that's not legal, that's not biblical. But I think the further that you get into some of these religions, it's easier to kind of, disregard certain things again under the name of God.
Yeah.
And I do think that we see that a lot, even if it's not quite as extreme as Chad and Lori. We see it in a lot of different religions. But I do know that in the past 5 years or so, of course, we've seen many documentaries coming out, on Netflix and
Mhm.
other places where the LDS church really is being pretty exposed.
Yeah.
And I have conspiracy theories around why that's happening, but that's maybe an
Sure.
offline conversation.
Sure, sure. Yeah, it's stunning when you just look at the amount. Every time some new case comes in, the first thing I'm like, how many kids do they have?
Yes.
And
Yep.
then it's like, okay, there's a clue there, and then it's
Yeah.
it's LDS too, and
Well,
it's like, does it create a ripe atmosphere for that to happen? The more shut off individuals are, the more closed off.
so
Is
yeah.
that? I don't mean to interrupt, but is
Oh,
that something where it's an attitude of, well, I was brought up this way. I've seen leaders, male figures, whoever get away with bad behavior on the inside, and they're supposedly all righteous with God and such. And
mhm.
then when that behavior travels to the outside, uh, are they sometimes just unaware how much society frowns upon things like that because they were able to get away with it within their religious bubble?
Yeah, so there's a couple different like underlying beliefs that I think are really important to point out. One of them is what we would call Christian domination or dominion,
Mhm.
which also you could put religious LDS in there, where there is this belief that that religious group is supposed to, like their God ordained, kind of purpose is to take over, to have dominion over a variety of different things. There's groups that practice what's called like seven mountains theology, where their whole goal is to have dominion over the political realm, the entertainment realm, the educational realm. So we have that where they believe that. In a lot of these religions, we have this belief that like we are these special chosen people and we're chosen by God, and we have a couple things. We are supposed to get other people to join us. And because God created the world and we serve that God, then we answer again to him instead of these earthly authorities, which then can lead towards all sorts of cognitive distortions as well as behavioral distortions of what is allowable, who can we discriminate against. And there is also usually a belief of what we would call, in a lot of cases, Christian persecution, or this belief that I will be persecuted for my faith. And that actually is a marker of my faithfulness. And so, yeah, when the world looks and goes, what? What is that? Why are you doing that? They say, okay, this is just evidence that I'm being persecuted for my faith and that I am doing something right.
Mhm.
So I need to keep doing it because that is what God is calling me to do. And I'm not here to say that that makes sense. I'm only here to say that I know that that's how a lot of people operate. I mean, those are teachings that are very core to a lot of high control religions. I have many friends who are former LDS, and we compare notes because I didn't grow up in the LDS church, but I grew up in a fundamentalist church, and we compare notes, and there's not much difference. And so, I know that a lot of these core teachings then set the foundation to say, here's what is okay. This is what is okay for us to do, because there's this saying of we are in the world but not of the world, and so therefore it allows us to do all of these things and commit really atrocious acts against people, all in the name of God, um, because this is our purpose here on earth is to, you know, get people on our side, and we can do that by any means necessary.
Are we at a point where we really need to re-examine our laws and the protections that religious
Yes.
organizations have?
Yeah.
Obviously, I would think that's a resounding yes from most, but with some groups, that's going to be, oh hell no, we have that separation. Um, but in terms of, and I certainly agree with that for governmental policy and such, although that's questionable half the time. But when we're talking about just accountability, and being able to get away with so many things. We've seen so many bad acts that get away with horrible things, but nothing is done till far after the fact, or nothing is done at all,
Mhm.
because it is a religious organization. It feels like we need to be able to get into these things from the outside and not say no, you can't have your religion or anything like that, but what the hell's going on here with these kids? What's going on with these
Right.
finances?
Yeah.
What's going on with these sort of things? And if the answers outside of that church would equate to, like felony type behavior or something far worse, which a lot of it can be, then something needs to stop. And that's no longer a religion at that point.
Mhm. Yeah. So again, I have thoughts around this that might span outside the scope of this conversation. But we do in the United States, we live in a country that is really dominated by a certain brand of Christianity. And so with that, there's a lot of policy and legislation that's passed and that supports those structures. So I do believe that they're wise enough to know that if they go after a group, whether it is the Mormon church or whether it is Jehovah's Witnesses, they know that at some point that's going to be turned on them because the same standard is going to be applied to them. So if we're going to go after, the LDS church for sexual abuse, there's a likelihood that we're going to have to go over to the SBC, the Southern Baptist
Everything.
Convention Church,
Everything should
right?
be looked at. Yeah,
Everything.
it's not like, "Oh, I'm gonna target you." It's like,
Yes.
"Hey, everybody should be looked at." There should be some sort of
Right.
oversight. If you're gonna run an organization like this, there needs to be some sort of oversight to it.
Mhm. Yeah, and so I think that people are wise enough to know that
Mhm.
they can't target just certain religions and leave Christian religions, whatever that
Yeah,
even
yeah,
means,
everything, yeah.
alone, right? It would be all essentially all or nothing. And so they choose nothing, which means that there are continued abuses and atrocities and even things like death. Like we talk about, Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow. It's like, yeah, I know they weren't technically a part of the LDS church, but that's where their roots are. And though we can say what they did is absolutely unequivocally not okay, we have to also look at how they got there. They didn't just wake up one morning and say, "Oh, I think that this is what we need to do." There was a whole thought pattern and belief system behind that. And I think that there's politicians and legislators in our country that understand if we really go in on some of these groups, there will be it'll turn the mirror and they're going to have to look at us as well. And that's not something they're ready to do.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of dollars to be made from religious people in terms of like how that interacts with
Mhm.
politics. So it's not in their best financial interest
Yeah.
to go down that road either.
Yeah, it's not necessarily they're not operating in the interest of their parishioners. It seems
Right.
so much it has to do with the finances and what they're going to
Yeah.
get at the end of the day,
Mhm.
and ultimately
Mhm.
how they can control the people that follow them.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Dr. Laura Anderson, thank you so much for coming on today and giving us this insight. It's been a very fascinating conversation. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been so wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Hey, it's Tony Bruschi. If you want more of our interview with our guests, be sure to check out our podcast, Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi. Just search that wherever you download podcasts and press subscribe. Also, you can check out our YouTube channel for the full video version of the interviews as well, under the same name, Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi. Check it out, subscribe, binge, and enjoy. Thanks for watching.